The last ride. The town of Blackwood was a quiet, forgotten place nestled in the mountains, a shadow of its former self. It had once been a bustling hub during the height of the railroad era. Now, only a few hundred people lived there, most of them elderly, with little reason to leave. The abandoned tracks that once brought life to the town were now rusted and overgrown, a relic of a bygone age. But those tracks carried a dark legend that refused to fade. A legend of the Phantom Train. Every year, on the anniversary of the crash, townsfolk whispered about the Midnight Express, a ghostly locomotive that would appear on the old tracks, doomed to relive the night of its tragic end. Most dismissed it as a mere ghost story, but there were always those curious enough to seek the truth. They often returned with terror in their eyes, if they returned at all. This year, however, would be different. This year, a group of young thrill-seekers from out of town, unaware of the full extent of the legend, decided to spend the night in Blackwood and find out for themselves if the stories were true. They had no idea of the horrors that awaited them. It was late October when the group arrived in Blackwood. The air was crisp with the first hints of winter, and the days were growing shorter. The group consisted of 5 friends. Jake, the leader. Emily, his girlfriend. Chris, the skeptic. Sarah, the one with a secret love of ghost stories, and Mark, the cameraman, who insisted on documenting everything for their YouTube channel. They had heard about the Phantom Train from a local urban legends website and were eager to uncover the truth. As they drove into town, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the mountains. The town itself felt eerie, with most of the houses dark and empty. The streets deserted. The only signs of life were a few old men, sitting on a bench outside the dilapidated general store, their eyes following the group as they passed. "Are we sure this is the right place?" Chris asked, his voice tinged with unease. "This is it," Jake replied confidently, though even he felt a chill down his spine. "We're staying at the Blackwood Inn. It's supposed to be the oldest building in town. Perfect place to start our investigation." The inn was a creaking, 3-story structure that had clearly seen better days. As they approached, the front door swung open, and a hunched old woman with piercing blue eyes stepped out to greet them. "Welcome to Blackwood," she said in a voice that sounded like the rustle of dry leaves. "You're here for the train, aren't you?" The friends exchanged uneasy glances. "You could say that," Jake replied. The woman's eyes seemed to bore into them. "Be careful what you wish for," she warned. "The Phantom Train is not just a story, it's a curse. A curse that has claimed many lives. Stay away from the tracks tonight, if you value your souls." Sarah shivered at the woman's words, but the others brushed it off as nothing more than local superstition. They thanked her and checked into their rooms, ignoring the sense of dread that had settled over them. As night fell, the group gathered in the inn's parlor, surrounded by dusty furniture and flickering candlelight. Mark set up his camera, while Jake laid out their plan. They would head to the old tracks just before midnight, the time when the Phantom Train was said to appear. "I still think this is a waste of time," Chris muttered, but the others ignored him. As they left the inn and made their way through the dark streets of Blackwood, the town seemed even more desolate. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under their boots, and the distant howl of the wind. The old tracks were barely visible under the overgrowth, a path leading into the unknown. When they reached the tracks, Jake checked his watch. It was 11:45 p.m. They set up their equipment. Cameras, voice recorders, and EMF meters. hoping to capture any sign of the supernatural. "I don't know about this," Sarah whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. "What if it's real?" "Then we'll have the best footage ever," Jake replied, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. As the minutes ticked by, an unnatural silence descended over the area. Even the wind had stopped, leaving the group in an eerie stillness. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, they heard it. The faint sound of a train whistle far off in the distance. At first, they thought it was their imagination, but the sound grew louder, closer. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and a light appeared down the tracks, growing brighter with each passing second. "It's just an old train," Chris said, though he sounded far less certain now. But as the light drew nearer, they realized something was terribly wrong. The train that emerged from the darkness was not of this world. It glowed with a pale, ghostly light, and its outline shimmered as if it were made of mist. The windows of the cars were dark, but as the train approached, they could see shadowy figures moving inside, their faces pressed against the glass. "No way, it can't be real," Mark whispered. His camera now pointed at the spectral train. The phantom train came to a screeching halt in front of them, and the doors of the nearest car slid open with a hiss. A wave of cold air rushed out, and they were hit with the stench of decay and burnt metal. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, panic rising in her voice. But before they could move, a figure stepped out of the train. A tall man in a conductor's uniform, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were hollow, and his voice echoed as if coming from a great distance. "All aboard," he intoned, raising his lantern. Emily screamed as she felt an invisible force pulling her toward the train. The others tried to grab her, but one by one, they too were drawn toward the open door. The force was too strong to resist, as they were dragged onto the train. The conductor's expressionless face watched them, and the doors slammed shut. Inside the train, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air was thick with dust, and the seats were worn and torn, covered in stains that looked like old blood. The walls seemed to close in around them, the shadows flickering as the train began to move. Jake tried to open the door to the next car, but it wouldn't budge. "We need to find a way out," he said, his voice shaking. "We can't stay here." They forced the door open and stumbled through the train, each car more horrifying than the last. In one car, they saw the passengers. Ghostly figures sitting motionless in their seats, their eyes empty and lifeless. They were dressed in clothes from different eras, all trapped in the same endless journey. Some of them were whispering, but the words were unintelligible, more like a low hum that reverberated through the walls. In another car, the group found themselves surrounded by mirrors. As they passed by, their reflections twisted and distorted, their faces melting into grotesque visages. The mirrors seemed to be alive, mocking them, showing them visions of their deepest fears. "Where are we?" Sarah cried, tears streaming down her face. This can't be real. Mark was frantically recording everything, but his camera was beginning to malfunction, the screen flickering as if the train itself was interfering with it. "We need to find a way out," he shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the growing noise. A cacophony of whispers, screams, and the clattering of the train on the tracks. In the next car, they encountered the ghosts of the crew. Conductors, porters, and engineers, all with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. They reached out to the group, their cold hands grasping at them, trying to pull them into the darkness. "Let us go!" Chris screamed, kicking at the hands that grabbed him, but they were relentless. Finally, they reached the engine room, where the heart of the train lay. The room was filled with the stench of burning coal, and the walls were covered in strange symbols, glowing with an otherworldly light. At the center of the room stood the conductor, his lantern casting eerie shadows on the walls. "You've taken your last ride," the conductor said, his voice now filled with malice. "Your souls belong to the train now." Jake stepped forward, his hands trembling. "No, we won't let you take us." The conductor laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent shivers down their spines. "You think you have a choice? The train is eternal, and so are those who ride it. Your fate was sealed the moment you boarded." Suddenly, the train lurched, and they were thrown off their feet. The walls began to close in, the air growing colder and thinner. The conductor's form began to change, his face contorting into a grotesque mask, his body elongating as he became something inhuman. The friends screamed as the train plunged into darkness, the sound of metal grinding against metal filling their ears. The last thing they saw was the conductor's twisted smile, his eyes glowing with an unholy light. When they awoke, they were no longer on the train. Instead, they found themselves standing on the tracks, the phantom train a distant memory. But something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The town of Blackwood was gone. In its place was a barren wasteland. The sky is sickly green, and the ground cracked and desolate. The tracks stretched endlessly in both directions, disappearing into the horizon. There was no sign of life, no sound, only an oppressive silence that weighed heavily on them. We made it out," Sarah whispered, though her voice was filled with doubt. But as they looked around, they realized the truth. They hadn't escaped. They were still on the train, still trapped in its twisted world. The wasteland was just another part of the phantom train's eternal journey, a place where lost souls wandered forever, never finding peace. Their bodies began to change, their skin growing pale and translucent, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They were becoming like the passengers they had seen on the train, doomed to ride the phantom train for all eternity. As the realization set in, the sound of the train's whistle echoed through the wasteland, and they saw it approaching once more, its ghostly light cutting through the darkness. The doors opened, and the conductor stepped out, his lantern held high. "All aboard," he said, his voice echoing across the barren land. The journey never ends. With no other choice, they stepped back onto the train, their spirits broken, their souls lost. The doors closed behind them, and the train began to move once more, its endless journey continuing into the night. And so, the phantom train rolled on, a never-ending nightmare for those who dared to seek it out. In Blackwood, the legend lived on, a warning to all who would listen. But for the friends, it was too late. They had taken the last ride, and there was no escape. Years later, another group of thrill-seekers would come to Blackwood, drawn by the same legend. They would hear the same warnings, see the same haunted eyes of those who knew the truth. But like those before them, they would not heed the warnings. And when the phantom train came for them, they would board it, unaware that they were stepping into a world where their only destination was despair. The train would continue its journey, gathering soul, feeding on fear, and ensuring that the legend of Blackwood would never die. For in the end, the phantom train was more than just a ghost story. It was a curse. A curse that no one could escape, and it was always waiting for its next passengers. Thank you for joining me tonight. Until next time, sleep well. If you can.